Right, we in Belleville at the Noble Park Centre, which in 2006 housed the offices of VP Kuranta, a division of Media 24, in which my first experience of a segregated newsroom and the beginning of my problems at Naspers. Okay, so we now at the what were the former offices of VP Kuranta, a division of Media 24, in which I encountered the first problem to do with the company with race segregation in the newsroom, where my colleagues were segregated according to the race classification system of apartheid. My colored colleagues were in hockeys, working on colored titles for former colored group areas. My so-called white colleagues were in separate hockeys, working on titles geared towards former white group areas. My black colleagues were completely cut off in a separate section, working on titles for former black township areas. I found this a very difficult thing to deal with. I was under the impression that this was now a transformation exercise, and what I was encountering was perhaps the last vestiges of a system that was in the process of transforming. Little did I know that there was no intention of the company to change the situation, that all my efforts to break down those barriers would come to naught, and I would end up with a 10-year-long, decade-long litigation involving apartheid and the company that was instrumental in the creation of the apartheid system. They were sort of under the impression that race segregation is divinely inspired by God, that we all segregated into separate groups through an act of inspiration by the divinity that created us. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with race segregation in the newsroom. And even though that segregation had no backing by the law itself, it was a de facto segregation, an invisible wall, as it were, between one ethnic identity and the next. The fact that I come from a diverse background, formerly from a position of privilege, with a diverse family, I've come granny from Maitland, I've got interesting history, doesn't change the fact that we were confronted on a daily basis with the legacy of separate development, and that there was absolutely no policy in place to combat and to mitigate that separate development legacy. So I ran into a brick wall so far as the editorial was concerned, and we've ended up in a dispute about editorial where there have been ecclesiastical charges brought against me in a civil court proceeding in which the corruption of the proceeding, unfairness of the proceeding is manifest. Well, we don't have a time machine to go back in time to 2006 to take a look at the newsroom. We're going to supply some dramatization of events, but we also have a survey of the content of the People's Post from that period. And we can use the tools of science and deduction and logic to survey the content, the writers, and to look at the demographics and the race profiles that were created by those demographics, and to assess whether or not what I'm telling you is the absolute truth. Okay, we are in front of the Wembley, a popular landmark in Athlone, and the reason we're here is because this is Belgravia Road. Belgravia Road was the location of the offices of Congress of South African Writers and a computer project known as KEX. It was also the offices at the time of Grassroots, which was a newspaper banned on several occasions by the Botha government during the state of emergency. We at a popular nightclub, the West End. It was the West End which would become the subject of debate at the Labour Court of South Africa after claims by Media 24 that I had no right to attend a mixed-race nightclub on a Friday night, since as they charged me in the ecclesiastical case against me that I am somehow a Jew in breach of my religion for attending an entertainment venue on the Friday night, which happened to be Shabbat. I was here after the late Robbie Jansen had extended an invitation, and I had kindly accepted the invitation and wished to pay my respects to the jazz man who was performing with the Glenn Robertson Jazz Trio.
What is jazz? Jazz is improvised music. Jazz is music you investigate, you do things to it, you nurture it. You get some new flower, you create a new sound. Robbie Jansen. In the interview with Lewis, Robbie Jansen makes disparaging remarks in respect of the music industry and its award to Jimmy Lulu. Under cross-examination, Lewis conceded that although the article suggested that he had interviewed Robbie Jansen at his home, he had in fact conducted the interview over the telephone, signed Cheadle. The history concedes that De Burger, for instance, promoted Verwoerd's ideals of Bantustans from an early stage. Occasionally, doubts about apartheid do surface, but in the main, the book reflects a total lack of concern for the company's support of the racist system. Signed Desmond Tutu, TRC Report, Volume 4. Robbie Jansen had suffered cardiac arrest and was on an oxygen ventilator. This was explained to Dean, who nonetheless persisted with her demands to speak to the musician, despite warnings from his doctor. Signed, Lewis. His reliance on a thesis of how members of his own self-defined branch of Judaism, should observe the Jewish Sabbath is nonsensical and irrelevant to the outcome of these proceedings. Signed, Karnowitz.
So the problem of my disenrollment from the white race back in 1988 and the reduction of my identity to merely an absurdity in the eyes of the courts speaks volumes as to the lack of resolve that we have in solving the problems of race classification and segregation in this country, and the legacy of apartheid, that I'm still battling to regain my identity as a human being in the eyes of the law with a judgment that reduces me to not even a person, that essentially negates who I am and niggerizes me and reduces me to a non-entity, a non-person. The country that supposedly protects these rights that we fought for being violated on a daily basis on the campuses of this nation.
Complainant only describes himself as a white when it suits him. Applicant wanted to assist us because he was a coloured. The views of Mr. Robbie Jansen are too controversial for a family newspaper. My family are very respectable. Coincidence. Coincidence. A miracle of sameness. The People's Post is trying to establish itself as a reliable and trustworthy medium. Coincidence of homogeneity based on South Africa's past. Mr. Lewis's evidence is unreliable because he engaged in a campaign that was against the company and its support of apartheid and its refusal to apologize before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Don't bring up the struggle!
Leviticus 25:44 states that I may indeed possess slaves, both male and female, provided they are purchased from neighboring nations. A friend of mine says this applies to Zimbabweans, but not Namibians. Can you clarify? Why can't I own Namibians?
I have a neighbour that insists on working on the Sabbath. Exodus clearly states that he should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to kill him myself?
A friend of mine feels that even though eating shellfish is an abomination, Leviticus chapter 11 verse 10, it is a lesser abomination than homosexuality. I don't agree. Can you settle this?
When I burn a cow on the altar for sacrifice, I know its smell is pleasing for the Lord. The problem are my neighbours. They say that the smell is not pleasing for them. Should I smite them?
Most of my male friends get their hair trimmed, including the hair on their temples, even though this is expressly forbidden by Leviticus chapter 19 verse 27. So, how should they die?
It was at 35 Wales Street at the offices of Cheadle Haysom Thompson that I met with Mr. Jason White in 2009 following an informa pauperis proceeding referral by the High Court of South Africa in which a complainant acts in terms of the law without sufficient funds to procure an attorney. Mr. White explained to me that his company, Cheadle Thompson, would not be able to assist me because the company's client was Media 24, the respondent in the matter. Coming so close to the hearing itself, it was a major blow to my hopes of procuring an attorney on a pro bono basis and with assistance by the High Court of South Africa. Jason White merely related the conflicts of interest at the company. Media 24 had been a client of the company. This was the first time that I found out that Cheadle Thompson had a major client, Media 24, the company that I was suing in the matter. At the end of 2009, I found myself participating in an unfair hearing at the Labour Court of South Africa, at which Mr. Cheadle himself was presiding over a matter affecting his business partners and his client, Media 24, who happened to be the respondent in the matter. Judgment was handed down in 2010 in my absence in a hearing in which I myself did not have an attorney. After filing a complaint at the South African Police Service, my affidavit detailing the corruption at Labour Court was referred to the National Prosecution Service. Needless to say, I received word back that they had declined to prosecute, and the matter has now been referred back to national prosecution. I'm a banned journalist. I was banned during the struggle against apartheid. I was banned because of my views about Naspers and race segregation in the newsroom. There's a attempted gagging order shortly after I was frog-marched out of the newsroom at Via Kuranta. I've been put on trial for writing about jazz music. I've been put on trial for attending a mixed-race nightclub at the West End. The company, Media 24, has accused me of abusing the Saki Saki Buddha Orchestra music in my documentary. The polarization between the black jazz and the jazz music and the jazz scene, and the Robbie Jansen story and the Jimmy Glidlu story, and the right of the late Robbie Jansen to say whatever it is that he felt like in a newspaper targeting his own backyard, and the right of people like Jimmy Glidlu to have views about music and so on. And all of that in the context of the Boere, the Afrikaner white supremacists who control Naspers, who think that jazz music is something impinging upon their identity as a people. That somehow jazz music is the opposite of Boere orchestra music. I don't see these as mutually exclusive terms. You know, the reason that she did not have access to Robbie Jansen, and the reason that she did not have Robbie Jansen's number, was because Robbie had suffered a cardiac arrest and he was under doctor's supervision. She's turned this into some example of I've created a deception because I wasn't at Robbie's home at the time that the interview was conducted, and therefore I'm making this up. I've fabricated events around jazz. I've fabricated the whole thing about apartheid, and she's some kind of angel. It's a miracle of sameness that things are the way they are. I think I'm another white knight. Wie is ek? Ek is 'n Khoisan. Wie is ek? Ek is 'n Griqua. Wie is ek? Ek is 'n mens. I'm on this earth. I'm an African. I live on this earth. It's African soil. I'm an African. No.
Is it?
No, you see, here's the thing, is that there's no law on our statute books that classifies people according to race. Those race laws, which were part and parcel of the apartheid system, were repealed, along with the Group Areas Act, along with the Immorality Act. There was a Population Registration Act, and that act is dead and buried. And yet we are still stuck with the persistence of the problem of race identity, with the perceptions created in our society that are so deeply ingrained that there's no biological basis for race. If you read my writing on the subject of race, you'll realize that race itself is a fiction, and what I consider very bad fiction. It's resulted in untold misery. Scientific racism has been completely shut down by the scientific community. There's no scientific basis for race.
Your writing that you accumulated over